How do the Gospels portray the apostles? Are they fearless leaders or cowardly fools? Well, each of our 4 Gospels has a different view, and in this video, we'll just be comparing the views of the Gospel of Mark and Matthew. Now, Mark was written first, and he has a negative view of the apostles. He consistently portrays the apostles as insignificant and foolish. Now, after Mark wrote, Matthew writes his own Gospel and used Mark as a source, and Matthew totally disagrees with Mark. Matthew thinks very highly of the apostles, and he presents them as important and wise leaders. And in this video, I'll be showing you how Matthew adds, edits, and omits from Mark to make Peter and the apostles more important. I'll begin by showing you how Matthew adds to Mark to achieve this goal. The first and most significant addition Matthew makes is about Peter. Now, let me ask you a question. Is Peter that important? Well, if you were to read the Gospel of Mark, you'd probably say no. Sure, in Mark chapter 8, Peter recognizes that Jesus is the Messiah, but that's about it. Now, Matthew totally disagrees, so he takes this story in Mark chapter 8 and adds to it significantly. We find this in Matthew chapter 16, where after Peter recognizes that Jesus is the Messiah, Jesus then launches into this very high praise of Peter. Jesus gives him the keys to the kingdom of heaven and tells him he will be the rock upon which he builds his very church. Thus, Matthew takes this very simple story from Mark, and by adding in these elements, makes it very clear that Peter is a crucial leader of the Jesus movement. And we see this consistently throughout Matthew. For instance, does Jesus walk on the water alone? Well, according to Mark chapter 6, yes, only Jesus walks on the water. But again, Matthew takes Mark's account and adds to it. So now Peter also walks on the water with Jesus. And Matthew doesn't just lift up Peter as a leader, but all of the apostles. One day, the apostles ask Jesus how they will be rewarded in the life to come. In Mark 10, Jesus says they will be given eternal life. But again, Matthew takes this story and adds to it. Now the apostles won't only receive eternal life, but they will also sit on the 12 thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel. So yet again, Matthew raises the prestige of the apostles. Now, let me ask you another question. Was there a Great Commission? Well, there isn't in Mark. Mark's gospel ends in chapter 16 with the resurrection. But Matthew concludes his gospel in chapter 28, where Jesus takes the apostles to a mountain and gives them all authority in heaven and earth and commissions them to be his representatives. So as you can clearly see, Matthew consistently adds to Mark to make Peter and the apostles more important. These examples demonstrate that Matthew believes that apostolic leadership is essential. Now, before we continue, let's just take a quick break to thank my beautiful patrons who keep this channel alive. Please consider signing up today if you're in a position to give. If not, please just make sure you hit that like button, leave me a comment, and subscribe. These things make a huge difference to the channel. Okay, so not only does Matthew add to Mark, but he also edits Mark to make the apostles more important and also less foolish. Let me show you how. So, do the sons of Zebedee ask Jesus if they can sit at his right hand? Well, in Mark 10, yes, James and John, the sons of Zebedee, come forward to Jesus and ask whether they can sit by his side when he enters his glory. Now, this is a pretty arrogant and presumptuous request. You're asking the Son of God if you can sit by his side in heaven. A very, very foolish question. So, this story in Mark casts James and John in a very poor light. And when Matthew reads this in Mark, he doesn't like it at all. So Matthew edits Mark. In Matthew's account of this story, it's not James and John who asked Jesus this question, but rather their mother. In Matthew chapter 20, we read, quote, "Then the mother of the sons of Zebedee came to him with her sons," end quote. Thus, Matthew shifts this foolish request from the apostles onto their mother. Let me give you another example. Did the disciples argue about who is the greatest? Well, in the Gospel of Mark, they do. In Mark 9, we read, quote, "Then they came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, Jesus asked them, 'What were you arguing about on the way?' But they were silent, for on the way they had argued with one another who was the greatest," end quote. So yet again, Mark is presenting the apostles as foolishly bickering amongst themselves. And Matthew again does not like this at all. So in Matthew 18, he edits this account. So now we read, quote, "At that time, the disciples came to Jesus and asked, 'Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?' End quote. So instead of arguing, the apostles simply asked Jesus in a dignified fashion, who will be the greatest? Thus, once again, Matthew is rehabilitating the image of the apostles. By making these edits, he makes them appear less foolish. Now, Matthew also wants to make the apostles to appear more understanding as well. So, do the disciples understand Jesus' phrase, the yeast of the Pharisees? Well, according to Mark, no. In Mark 8, Jesus says to the apostles, quote, "Do you still not perceive or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes and fail to see? Do you have ears and fail to hear? And do you not remember? End quote. Now in Matthew chapter 16, he still includes this rebuke, but then adds on to the end, quote, "Then they understood that he had not told them to beware of the yeast of bread, but of the teaching of the Pharisees and the Sadducees," end quote. So unlike Mark's account, where the apostles never get it, Matthew tells us that they eventually do understand. And we find the same thing regarding John the Baptist. Did the disciples understand that John the Baptist was Elijah? Well, in Mark chapter 9, it's really not clear whether the disciples understand this or not. Jesus says, quote, "But I tell you that Elijah has come, and they did to him whatever they pleased, as it is written about him," end quote. So in Mark, there's no comment on whether the apostles understand. But Matthew wants to make it very clear that the disciples did understand that John the Baptist was Elijah. Therefore, when Matthew retells this account, he adds on to the end, quote, "Then the disciples understood that he was speaking to them about John the Baptist," end quote. Therefore, hopefully you can see that Matthew both adds and edits Mark to make the apostles more important, less foolish, and more understanding. All of these examples demonstrate a clear pattern of how Matthew is reshaping Mark's material in order to present the apostles as esteemed leaders and not as fools. And we are not done yet. We now come to my favorite part. So Matthew adds, he edits, but he also omits from Mark. And what Matthew omits from Mark is just as important as to what he adds. So, do the disciples understand the parable of the sower? According to Mark, they don't. Jesus says to them, quote, "Do you not understand this parable? Then how will you understand all the parables? The sower sows the word," end quote. Now, when Matthew tells this parable in his gospel, he omits Jesus' concluding statement denouncing the apostles. Next, did Peter act foolishly on the Mount of Transfiguration? According to Mark, Peter offers to build Jesus, Moses, and Elijah 3 tents. And then Mark adds that Peter said this because, quote, "he did not know what to say, for they were terrified," end quote. Matthew again reads this in Mark and doesn't like it at all. He doesn't like this denigrating comment about Peter. So when Matthew retells his story in chapter 16, he simply omits this statement. Staying on the Mount of Transfiguration for a moment, in Mark, Jesus mentions that the Son of Man must rise from the dead. And again, Mark adds another comment about the apostles, quote, "So they kept the matter to themselves, questioning what this rising from the dead could mean," end quote. So yet again, in Mark, they don't understand. And yet again, in Matthew, he omits this statement about the disciples not understanding. At this stage, I think you would agree with me that this pattern is undeniable. We now come to my final and favorite examples. Can people act outside apostolic leadership? According to Mark chapter 9, yes. We read, quote, "John said to him, 'Teacher, we saw someone casting out demons in your name, and we tried to stop him because he was not following us.' But Jesus said, 'Do not stop him, for no one who does a deed of power in my name will be able soon afterward to speak evil of me. Whoever is not against us is for us,'" end quote. So here in Mark, it's clear that you don't need to be working with the apostles to be a part of the Jesus movement. Now, everything that we've seen in Matthew so far totally contradicts this. Matthew believes that you must be under apostolic leadership, and therefore Matthew omits this entire story. I think this is of huge significance, the fact that Matthew totally omits this story. And here's a bit more speculation from me, so take this with a grain of salt. I think Matthew especially hates this statement here from Mark, "Whoever is not against us is for us." In another story in Matthew's gospel, we find a straight reversal of this statement. We read, quote, "Whoever is not with me is against me." And I feel these contrasting statements from Mark and Matthew nicely summarizes the differences between these authors. Mark does not believe apostolic leadership is important. You don't need to be under their authority. In contrast, Matthew believes a Christian must be under the authority of an apostle. Thus, he adds, edits, and omits from Mark to make Peter and the apostles more important, less foolish, and more understanding. And one cannot deny the overwhelming amount of evidence behind this argument. And furthermore, what really strengthens this argument is how nicely it follows on from what we saw in the previous video. What we saw previously is that Matthew hates the Jewish leadership, and therefore we shouldn't be surprised that Matthew extols the apostolic leadership. Matthew believes the apostles have replaced the Jews as being the leaders of God's people, the leaders of the new church. And this now nicely kicks off our next video, where we shall see Mark and Matthew's different views of the church. Now, before we finish up, a quick mention of my sources. I would love to take credit for discovering all of these examples, but I definitely didn't. Most of them were from this thesis paper from Sarah Cook, a fellow Australian from the Australian Catholic University. Her article is fantastic. I've linked it below, and almost all the examples from this video were taken from her paper. In her paper, she provides this really nice summary, quote, "While Mark emphasizes the disciples' lack of understanding, Matthew highlights their strong understanding. While Mark gives the disciples little authority on which to claim legitimate leadership, the Mateen Jesus gives the disciples explicit authority to lead his future church. While Mark ends the disciples' role with desertion and betrayal just before Jesus' death, Matthew includes a post-resurrection meeting with the risen Jesus, symbolizing Jesus' handing over evangelization responsibilities." End quote. Again, her full article is linked below. It's definitely worth the read. Okay, this was certainly a very long video, and if you've made it this far, thank you so very much. You're definitely in the right place. Before you leave, please make sure you like, comment, and subscribe. And if you really want to make a difference to the channel, please make sure to become a patron. Patrons help this channel achieve its goal of creating a library of videos that objectively and respectfully analyze the Bible. Thank you for watching until the end, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.